All right. Hello, hello. Guten Abend, dobre večer, buenos tardes, and hi and welcome to a live stream and AMA and live coding session that I wanted to do again. I'm very happy that you can join, and please feel free to use the chat. As always, I would like to have these live sessions as interactive as possible. Say hi from where you are watching. Also, let me know if the video and audio works all right. That's always a fear when live streaming. And yeah, a few updates that I wanted to share with you, and then also maybe we can do some live hacking or live coding for some Quarkus stuff if you're interested. Also, you can suggest some things in the chat. And as always, please feel free to ask any questions on Java related things, Quarkus, developer productivity related things, or anything that you would like to ask. Really ask me anything. And yeah, happy to do this. So yes, say hello in the chat, and let's see. So things that I wanted to share first of all to get this going, to warm up a little bit, are just some updates from my side. Over the summer, I actually haven't done many live events. I will do a few more now in October and November. So will be traveling in person again to conferences that I'm already really looking forward to. I have 3 events here now in October and November already, where if you're there, you will find me. So where I can share some wisdom, hopefully, on Java related things, especially on these conferences, Quarkus related stuff. So what we have here is, let's try this. That's the first one where I'll be. That's actually this week in Poland, in Krakow. Bite My Code conference, for which I will talk about Quarkus, so state-of-the-art enterprise Java with Quarkus, and what that means. I'm already looking forward to that already. And yeah, so that's going to be this week. I don't know if coincidentally you'll be attending this conference there as well. You can let me know in the chat. And then in November, there are 2 more conferences where you might also find me. One is this one. That's a developer conference, as the website says, Öredev conference in Malmö, Sweden, 8th to 10th of November, where I will also speak about Quarkus. That's also a very interesting conference. I've attended that a few times, and while I'm helping out in the program committee, so that's a really interesting one with interesting different topics, not just Java or even not just development, but some interesting tech in general. And the other conference where you might find me is in Israel, Java Summit, also November, and that's going to be interesting because for some reason I've never made it to Israel so far, so I'm really excited. That'll be my first time, and I will also speak there. So that's a 1-day conference, but luckily I can spend some more days there. And yeah, I'm interested and excited how that's gonna be. And yeah, then some content updates and stuff I've been doing in the last time. So if you're interested in more Java and Quarkus related things, then there's your reminder to maybe check out some workshops. I already have some next dates that folks can register in December. We're going to do modern enterprise development with Quarkus. So that's a full day workshop, how to get effective, how to get started with Quarkus related stuff. Especially I try to do this on a real world perspective. So really like with the real world project in mind, not just going through all the guides. That would be boring, or you can do this yourself, but really trying to see what makes sense for projects from my experience and from my view. And also effective testing, because that's, I think, such an important topic. There will be a whole day dedicated to that, how to effectively test applications, and what to keep in mind there for real world projects. So also more than just hello world programming and things like that. And if you're besides that interested in some other company internal things, feel free to reach out. or if you prefer actually self-studying on a video format on demand, so whenever you like, just without communicating with anybody else, you can check out my video courses also on my website. And a few things that I've been sharing in the last weeks that you can find on YouTube or on my blog, as always. So one thing that was quite interesting, because I needed that for a project, was how to upload files with Quarkus, especially since the Quarkus way with REST Easy Classic, and REST Easy Reactive changed a bit in the past, and as always, there is some minor differences in the details, and especially if you do something like a multi-file upload, that always has been a little bit challenging if you have done that in enterprise applications in general. And there are some helpful things in Quarkus and how to do that, so I wanted to record a video here. And that's a fun one. That's also what I just recently posted, using Git on a command line effectively, because I always use Git on a command line. Actually, I'm not a big fan of what you see is what you get editors. So there are some tips that I think really make you productive just in using them on the command line, and then you don't really miss anything. So you can check that out. It's also on YouTube. And a few more things on Quarkus. So this one has really been helpful for a real world project, how to configure Quarkus URLs when you're behind some sort of reverse proxy setup, usually HTTPS, some certificates and things like that. Why? Because then if you produce your URLs, then the URLs are user facing, and the user has to, of course, invoke the correct URL using HTTP and all that. But sometimes your application has to access and emits that as well in hypermedia, for instance. And this is what's been showing here, where I'm actually using this with Istio and Kubernetes and certificates. So that's always a fun topic. So maybe that's helpful for a few of you. And another thing, that's another command line topic, which I think is kind of cool. Just a few tips how to use the command line as a file explorer. Or sounds a little bit crazy, but I'm actually using the command line solely. I'm not really using a file explorer anymore. And there are also a few things that are just helpful in order to make this get this going a little bit more. All right, so quite quiet in the chat for now. If you're watching, just please feel free to say hi and from where you're watching. And of course, if you have any question related to Java stuff, to Quarkus stuff, or developer productivity, or anything else, really ask me anything, then feel free to just put this into the chat, and I'll be answering that. Other than that, I thought it would be cool if we just do a little bit of live coding, shall we? So especially for the next content pieces that I'm producing, I needed to update some Quarkus kind of getting started application, or Quarkus Hello World, not Hello World, but a Quarkus example application that shows all of the benefits why developers should care about Quarkus for projects. And as you might know, Quarkus moves really quickly, so there's always a new version out there quite quickly, that if you do some example projects, or if you actually trying to demo this in some way, you need to keep at it, or need to be behind that, which we're going to do. So I thought we would be interesting to just hack a little bit into that. I didn't prepare much anything because I think for these live sessions, it's always a little bit more fun to just see me, doing stuff right away, and see me struggling with this. So that's, I think, gonna be fun and interesting. And so Frederick, hi to Sweden. Yeah, that's great. And let's see. So let's have a look at this project in a second. That's called Quarkus Playground, what I'm gonna show. Oh, and we have a question in the chat I quickly want to answer. Hello, Sebastian. Hello. Do you think everyday Java developer must know Kotlin? So must know? No, definitely not. Because must is a strong word. Especially for Java. Java is such a wide ecosystem and so widely used that you have no problem in projects and solutions to do stuff. especially with recent Java versions. I mean, that was already the case, I think, for Java 8 actually, with the functional stuff that you could do with lambdas and streams. And even with recent versions, I recently took a deeper dive into new JDK features, text blocks, records, things like that, which have very interesting features. What I would advise you, if you're kind of interested in this topic, is to just have a look at it, but not necessarily, like use it in a project already, or not necessarily say, hey, we have to now adopt Kotlin and things like that. It's always interesting to look at new languages, especially if they trying to change your point of view a little bit, your mindset, how you think of a technology, because it offers new features or something like this. So it offers new, perspectives or paradigms. But other than that, it's kind of like, should I use this for my projects? And my answer would be no, especially not for the typical production enterprise projects, because it's not required. So to answer your question, no, must not use Kotlin. No, definitely. If anything, a lot of Java developers don't know about the recent JDK features, such as records, sealed classes, text blocks, switch, the extended switch things. That's, I think, much more interesting, and also allows you to do a lot of cool stuff. And then I'm really not, missing much there in the language. And I also keep saying that in general, if you look into, proper code quality practices, such as using proper delegation, using abstraction, thinking about domain-driven design, helps you much, much more in navigating your code and keeping a clean code than, other fancy JVM languages. I mean, no offense to Kotlin, a lot of developers love that language, but to answer your question, no, definitely not. Hello to Bangalore. That's cool. I hope your time zone is not too crazy. What's that? 3.5 hours, I think. Yeah, that should be fine. So international crowd. That's nice. All right, so if you have any more questions, just always put them in the chat. What I want to show now is this example project, how's my key binding? There we go. That is called Quarkus Playground, actually, that I just wanted to update for a few recent things. So what we're gonna do is to just bump the Quarkus version, and let me make this bigger for you, and just update this to the recent things. So what I would like to show, which Java version do I have installed? 18. Yeah, let's bump this maybe to 18, or let's do 17. That's I think that's the LTS version, if I'm not mistaken. So the Java versions and Quarkus versions, they bump quite quickly nowadays. So here, luckily, that's written on the website, Quarkus 2.13.3. That's gonna be that version here. And again, I didn't prepare anything here before, so when I built this now, it's probably going to try to download the internet. But as I said, for this example project in the live stream, I just want to update a few more things here, so maybe you can, see my usual workflow. And then also, if you have some questions along the way, feel free to ask. What I want to prepare in this example project is the sort of, why you should care about Quarkus type of thing, and for developers, and then is to say, why you should use this, what cool features are there. I definitely want to show more of the dev mode things. There are some cool features out there. Some remote dev, maybe some panache, some Qt and things like this. So, oh God, I think it's a little bit slower because of my live streaming. Usually I cannot complain about my internet, but now, well, that's the Quarkus way. And we're gonna update that. And then once that is building, then we see what we have. Because very rarely, now it's getting more and more stable. Quarkus still has some changes when you've been using an API, but now it's been, from Quarkus 1 to 2, there were a few things that were changed with Qt and things. But now it is a little bit more stable, so it should be actually quite straightforward. But I always strive, when I show some examples, to have a sort of decent or latest version, just, to have a little bit more real-world examples. What I also might show is the coding guide, code.quarkus.io. That's also kind of cool. We can have a quick look at that, actually, just to, let's say, Quarkus REST Easy. Reactive with let's do JSON-B and something like this to generate an application, which is always kind of cool to do this so quickly, but usually I'm not showing that for the reason that code with Quarkus, that should be, for the reason that I'm not quite happy what that produces out of the box. For example, it produces these Maven wrappers that I usually am deleting, and the POM XML is also a little bit, well, the first thing I usually go is I go over the POM XML that is generated by code.quarkus.io and then, you know, clean it up a little bit. Like, for example, in most cases, I'm not using the native build, so I can remove that, and then I would just, you know, also format this a little bit. So I usually go and say, okay, actually make this a little bit more readable, maybe having some spaces between these dependencies, things like that, what the build plugins are, do I actually need all of this, and things like that. So that's the reason why I usually start from a little bit cleaner perspective. And then I usually end up with a POM that looks like that, that is just a little bit smaller. I have all of the dependencies that I need, dependency management with the Quarkus version, and that's pretty much it, including the Java version. Okay, let's see how this works. I think that is just quite straightforward. This doesn't include any persistence yet, so let's build this just again. I'm gonna close this example project again. That was just for, you know, demo purposes. So then typically what I do, I would start this out to try it. Quarkus app running this locally, which is quite fast. So, you know, it's the nice thing about Quarkus. Then we can open this up with my browser, and there is nothing there listening. Why? Because that should be, I think, orders.html or something like that. Yep, there we go. So I even have to see what this does. Ah, yeah, so you can order something. I haven't used this in a while, so I know as little about this thing as you. Okay, there's some coffee orders, so this is probably the example. Ah, yeah, that I might even live code with this type of form. Once I show this on some conference, there is typically orders controller. So what you see here is the queued example that is being used, you know, this type of syntax, because we have the import of Quarkus REST Easy Queued. Yes, so that's REST Easy Classic, basically, with Queued. And then we have a controller that handles this. So with the path, the JAX-RS path, that's also a JAX-RS class, it's going to forward this thing to a template instance by injecting such a template. In Quarkus, that's resources templates, and then the name of the template here, and returning the instance with some rendered data. So this looks good. That's what we need. I might probably, let's see, might live code that. Then once I show this off, and what the orders controller does, it says coffee shop add coffee. And yes, so that's basically this class here, and this stores the whole thing in a map. So we have this, oh yeah, so that's just my domain object, coffee, with some, you know, type stored as string, and then we can have that as such. Okay, cool. And then with this we can start, and then we can change it to persistence, shall we? Okay, so let's do that. Unless you have some other questions, then type them into the chat. And what I typically like to show is this with some database. There are many ways to get that started. There's a so-called dev UI and dev services in Quarkus that help me doing this, so I could you know, have something that sets this up. But I usually like to set up a database manually, because then I have more control over. So this depends a little bit what you would like to do. What we will have to do is include Quarkus and then something to map our database. I usually use the Hibernate ORM Panache way, so not just Hibernate, but this Panache repository. If you don't know what that is, then I highly recommend to check this out. That's very helpful for you know, coding with Quarkus. If we have some, where is it, persistence somewhere, Hibernate with JPA and Panache. which really does a cool thing. It looks a little bit similar to Spring Data JPA repositories. And with this, we can map all of our entities a little bit easier, or actually query them easier by using either a entity pattern or a repository pattern, which is usually what I prefer. So then we have what is called a repository, a Panache repository, that then implements a lot of helpful methods for us. So basically how this works, well, first of all, I need to include the dependency of saying Quarkus and then JDBC Postgres, which then already configures my Postgres instance. And now what I will do, I will run this as Quarkus dev, which I always like. Here you see, okay, now it's already downloading, but also you can keep Quarkus dev running and just coding, and you can even change the POM XML, and the code was just would just reload and re-download all of my required packages and dependencies, which is really cool. And with this, that's just really helpful. And there we go. Okay, question in the chat. As Quarkus is using Vertex, do we also need to learn that? And how is the community for support for Vertex? Do we need to learn that? No, we don't. That's the good thing. All of that is under the hood. And I can tell you also from experience, because I've been using Vertex standalone a few times, but I'm also not a Vertex expert, like far from it. And I can tell from experience it is nicely abstracted. So even if you use plain JAX-RS or plain servlet API stuff, you don't need to care too much about the lower level details, because this is just implemented. So really you don't need to know it if you go for the straight, this example way of implementing some JAX-RS resources or some other resources using, I don't know, service and events, WebSocket, whatever you would like to have. You don't need to care about the lower level details. That is really sort of abstracted away, which I think is a good thing. You can inject all of these Vertex types and then handle them in a low level way if you want, but really you don't need to. So I think that's kind of cool. And yeah, so I love your videos about Vim tricks. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. You too. If you have some Vim question or anything else, developer productivity related, yeah, happy to answer that. If anything comes to your mind, please just feel free to put it into the chat as well. Otherwise, we might want to continue with our Quarkus stuff. So what I just now did was Quarkus dev, and here you can see actually there are so-called dev services, and if I didn't include anything here for the database, it even says, by the way, the default data source Postgres now has been started, which uses a Docker thing under the hood. Why? Because I didn't configure and start any database. So it's a sort of, a nice way to do that. And now it runs database provided by test containers, which you can see here. And I didn't start this up, right? So this was just started right away. And now, while this is boring because I don't have an entity yet, but let's change that. And this is really cool because it is so fast to create that, right? So if I say, okay, we have this coffee entity, or not entity yet, we would like to make it an entity, right? So we'd say, okay, that's an entity that should reside in table, I don't know, name coffees or orders maybe, or coffee orders, something like this. And then we say, okay, an entity has to have an ID, which should be a generated value. So we include this, and then it has a type, right? And that's pretty much it. And that's already fair enough. I use this sort of pattern of making these types public. So I know this looks a little bit weird as a Java developer, why I'm not making this private and having a getter and setter. I could do this, same outcome. But for these simple types where you're like, okay, you would provide a getter and setter probably anyway, so that's just more straightforward. But all of that is supported as usual. So that's just the style here. And if you have a look at the Quarkus guides, that is sort of provided there. But you can do this as you wish. Okay, so that's one thing. And then what we do now, we store that here just in the hash map. We're going to remove this, of course, and say, okay, all of these things should now be provided from a repository. So I will use this approach and say that's going to be a coffee repository. Coffee repository, which I'm going to code real quick. That should implement Panache repository, which would be a coffee. Panache repository implements this for a repository that actually has a long ID, which I don't have. So in my case, I have to implement Panache repository base that also has the ID type, which would in my case should be a UUID, just because. And this can be empty for now. And I say, okay, that should be an application scope bean. And this coffee repository, I can inject this now here in my coffee repository. And then say, okay, in order to, let's see, get all of the coffees, I use this repository and say list all. That just lists, well, my coffee values. And this is a method, this and many others are default methods that are then implemented by this repository base. So very similar, to what you had in Spring. And that is just really easy to do. Same case here, if I say coffee repository, that should be save, store, no, persist. I always forget the, persist coffee, of saying, okay, store this now, persist the coffee here, and then maybe return the ID, which then should be, and now I also have to look up the persist given entity and have to look up the documentation. I can say, okay, persist that, and I can make the whole thing transactional, and then it will return the same entity and persist that entity, which means in our case, the ID then should be set because that's a generated value. We can try this out in a second. And here, similar thing, we can say coffee repository, find by ID, and then the ID is already known to be the ID type, like this UUID, and then can return this, right? So I hope you're still with me. So we just implemented real quick such a coffee repository and injected this to sort of make a database thing out of it. All right, what I'm gonna do now, I'm gonna call this here. I think that was, that's a good question actually. What's the name of the path? Coffee resource, coffees. Okay, get coffees. Let's see what we got here. And it has been restarted real quick. And now I can say, can I post something here? I think yes, by create coffee. And then the object should be type and something for a JSON object. Okay, so let's say type espresso, something like that, right? And it says, okay, exception. Of course, as always, live coding, everything can go wrong. And probably you know it already if you paid attention and you know a little bit about enterprise APIs. Of course, the transaction is not active, and it even nicely tells me what to do. Transaction is not active. Consider adding add transaction to your method. Okay, yeah, of course, if I would have read the specification or something like that, I can say I would like to have a transactional context, at least for these methods that do something with my repository, or, well, here it's not required, but in any case, I can just say for all of them, add transactional on my method. And then this should be fine. You can press S to reload in this console. And now it says, okay, great, 201 created. And now let's see. Okay, looks quite nice. Now this has been created with this espresso. Let's do this again. And let's do this again with the cappuccino. And now that seems to work. Okay, that's kind of cool. So this works. Now it depends how my database is being set up, which is quite fun because I didn't set it up at all yet. So that works quite nicely. Why? Because of these Quarkus dev services. So I can say if you go to /q/dev/, it will show you actually a dev UI, which you can access. So that's a default nowadays in Quarkus. And it shows you, okay, it has even some, stuff for the data sources. Why? Because I included the JDBC data source for Postgres. So then it says, okay, you would like to have a Postgres database. And I didn't configure it yet. So I could set the properties, but I didn't. And because I didn't, you see the dev services, and then, yeah, that's the Postgres database that has been. It sets up the default properties or the default way that it just starts up this with test containers, which is quite helpful. But well, it's nice, but in most of my cases, I actually don't use this. I use my own database even locally, because then I can just handle it easier and have my own, way of producing test data and things like that. Okay, let's go into the chat. You posted a few things. Please show your approach for TDD in Quarkus when developing REST services talking to DB using JPA. Okay, I'll come to that in a second. Greetings from Costa Rica. Hola, that's super cool. Wanted to mention that I saw your key videos and enjoy my own UH key V2 thanks to it. Oh, I'm really happy to hear that. In case you folks don't know, Francisco is referring to that, the ultimate hacking keyboard, which I think is a very nice one. That's a keyboard I'm using right now. So I'm not sponsored to say this, but I'm just using it. What is cool about that, it has more modifier keys, so you can actually stay on your home row, like in your Vim experience, without changing your hand position if you have to press delete, insert, the cursor arrows, things like that. So there are more modifier keys if you have a look at that. I mean, it's also a split layout, but that's just the way it is. I mean, I don't really care that much about it. It's quite nice, but anyway, the extra modifier keys I think are the killer feature, and it's a really nice one. And you can program all of the keys on the firmware in that keyboard. So I'm a big fan of that. So yeah, I'm really happy, and I'm glad you enjoy it. And I hope it didn't take too long to ship. For me, this took months, but ordered it back in March this year. Yes. I know, for me that was the same. I ordered it during 2020 and it wasn't better for the waiting time, but it's, I think, worth it. Super cool. Okay, so now to the question to TDD approach in Quarkus when developing REST services. For me, TDD, test-driven development, is, well, it's an interesting question, because what TDD means, you can look up the definition and say, okay, how do you define your software development process? Like, when should you write your tests? How do you define your features and when something is done, and all of the requirements? And what I like about the approach of TDD is to say you focus on the requirements that you have, and then first of all you define your tests, or your validation criteria, to say it more broadly, when your software is done or not. And in this way, it is really not only it enables you to be more sort of complete, that you're not forgetting about some feature or some side effect, that some functional one, that you say, okay, you define this first and then you build up some tests. But also what I really like about the TDD approach is, for me, actually more a human reason. Because why? Because of the dopamine effect of writing some code and some tests. So what does that mean? If I write some software and then I try it out here, in my browser or on the command line, what I just did, and say, like this, good enough, right? It already works. And now if I have to go and write some tests, it feels like a burden, because I know it already kind of works, right? I just tried it out and it does work, right? And now writing a test feels like an additional burden, although I already know I'm kind of done already. So what TDD does is that quite nicely it tells you, okay, you should write that verification first, you should write that test first, and then say, okay, once you write this, and then in the beginning your test is red, or it doesn't even compile yet, or it goes against your API and this doesn't work, and then once it does work, your test is green, and then you can go home, right? And then you're done. Because then it's not like, okay, now I have to write some tests, because the test already has been written. So it's kind of like, you get the dopamine effect, this nice feeling once everything is done, and your test is green, and you have a test, and your test has been written by following the specifications, which I think is kind of cool. So this is, in my mind, kind of like the big benefit of using TDD. And how to do this, my approach would then be, actually, that's a very nice question. Let's do this. My approach would be the following, to say, okay, I go into my project, and let's do the example of having this coffee and loading the coffee again from the database, is to say, I actually have to see if I have a test here. I should. Oh yeah, coffee IT. That is an integration test that actually uses my system. This one is super simple. It just says, okay, go to this thing, go invoke this /coffee and get, that's it. And then return and assert that this is actually coffee dot. So basically what it does, oh, interesting. Settings, JDK 17, there we go. I actually use 18 with adoptum, this type of thing. Yeah. Okay, try again. If I run this test now that's green. And what it did, it just, well, it actually accessed here this 8080/coffee, and it asserted that this is equal to, you know, coffee dot. So basically, if I say, okay, you're gonna change this, and then the test should fail. So typically what I do is I say, okay, now I'm about to implement something like, you know, please load the coffee orders out of the database, or say, okay, test create. Let's see how quickly I can do this. Create coffee order. And then what I do now, to answer your question, I always try to do it from a high level perspective first, because that's going to be easier with the levels of layers of abstraction, and say, okay, what do I want to test? What is actually my test scenario? If you would ask a testing person or the user or the specification document, what is the point here? And basically you're going to say, well, try to create a coffee with type, what I just did, I don't know, espresso, for example. And then basically say, okay, verify that coffee is in the system, or something, that coffee you know, exists and has type espresso, something like this, right? And that's how I usually set this up, of just following the requirements, putting it in pseudocode, in code comments, in prose, and you know, whatever, just saying, okay, what do you want to test? And then I'm going to go and implement how this looks like in the test. So basically, create coffee with type espresso. What does this look like? And then basically, first of all, and I always recommend to do this, I would then, you know, I would stay on this abstraction level and implement this in either a private method or in another delegate, like this class basically. And that's super simple. That's just, you know, a Java class that I instantiate, and this one includes an HTTP client, because that's going to be an integration test that tests it from the outside. So basically I say, okay, you know, go here, and I don't know if I have the time to implement all of it, but basically I can say, okay, create coffee order. And then I might already, you know, trying to define here the interface of saying create a coffee with a specific type. Okay, and then I go and say coffee system create coffee with a type, okay, espresso. And this basically is the implementation of that comment, so I can delete it, right? So that was just create coffee espresso. Okay, and then you continue and say, okay, verify that the coffee exists. Okay, here you see that there was a missing detail, which coffee exists, right? So then you say, okay, wait a second, when I create the coffee, then I need the coffee ID, right? And all of that is still part of your TDD scenario. That is part of your higher abstract business use case, because that is what the tester would define, or your user would define, and saying, okay, I want to create a coffee, and then I get some receipt or some ID, or I get some link, or whatever it looks like. And this, should be accessible. So then I say, okay, it should return, I don't know, a string of the ID or the UUID or whatever you would like to have. Actually, I would say something like a URI would make sense for a link, whatever. And then you say, okay, this should now be the coffee. And then I'm going to verify that the coffee exists. So something like coffee system, I don't know, load coffee or retrieve coffee or fetch coffee for a specific ID or URL. And then you say, okay, now I'm going to get whatever, usually a coffee type. And with this, I actually, also advise not to use the same types like in the production, because that should be part now of a system test. But it can be, this depends what you're trying to do. And then you say, okay, what should this be? And I say coffee. Okay, coffee. That's actually the order, or loaded coffee or something like that. And that then can be implemented, right? So what I'm doing is always I'm trying to define what I would like to have, and then I step down and implement this. And since you ask how to do this with REST and databases and JPA, that is actually a very nice abstraction level where I can separate this. So here, what you just saw, that is now my integration test code, and that could reside in its own project, like a system test project. And very often I do so. And with this, you can implement that and then go against and test against the environment that we just created. So something like that. And this, then can be helpful for that. So just let's finish this and finish the example to say, okay, retrieve coffee, that then in this case should say return. Now I think I have to change the base target for saying base target should now not be /coffee but /. Let's see where this is being used. Base target .path coffee, and create coffee here, retrieve coffee. So base target path coffees. No, not the path. This should be the client dot target of the coffee URL, and saying, okay, now request media type application JSON, and saying, okay, get this coffee class. I hope this works. If I create this like here real quick, and create coffee should say base target path coffees plural, and then saying, okay, post request post entity JSON, which can be then let's say that's going to be a JSON create object builder of saying type build, and the response, and then from the response I think header, get header string for location this should be. I hope that is provided somewhere here. Let's see if that's actually the case. So we're gonna post this, and that should be, oh yeah, URI create from this. So just real quick to implement that. That's a little bit quick and dirty now what I'm doing, but I hope you get the idea. And then saying loaded coffee, a type, assert that type is equal to espresso. Verify that coffee exists and has type espresso. So that's basically that part. So then you see this is quite readable, and let's go against the system and says, okay, create instance y JSONB exception, illegal access, cannot access class, coffee with modifiers, probably because of the, okay, that's interesting. Do I have some coffee? Let's see where this actually has come from. Access type, maybe because of this. Does it need to be public? I'm not quite sure. Yes, it does. Okay, so now you see that this works. By the way, never trust a test that only has been green. So let's change something here. So it should break and say, okay, that's espresso and not espresso 1. So it actually gets back from the database. Let's say latte. We're going to load this, and then we see if it's actually in the system. And yes, it is. So that works. Okay, so that's a very basic example for a system test with this sort of test-driven approach. And you showed doing TDD with system tests. In which situation do you create component tests, unit tests for CDI beans to test business logic and repository tests? If I want to test something that is the business logic where it's more about the logic and less about the integration, which nowadays is actually gets more and more seldom. So what does that mean? This test here, it basically, that is a system test, and you can think of it like something that sits outside of your system and tests your system. If I can quickly draw this somehow, if I would say, you have your coffee shop application here, something like that, and you have your system test, something like that, and then this is being accessed by your system test. So this is your system test with the IT classes, and this is your application that is running, right? And this here uses HTTP from your test perspective, and then your coffee shop instead has the database and all of that stuff that then it accesses to and things like that, right? So that's quite straightforward. What a component test or a code level test does is it takes the code of the coffee shop, so it has the code connection, or it needs to have the code connection. Here theoretically also has the code connection because it resides in the same project. But now I could use the coffee IT somewhere else. Then I would need to redefine their class, but actually that's a good idea anyway, and then put it elsewhere. But then what I would do if I say more like this is a very, very basic example just for a basic unit test. And that just instantiates the class and calls the method, so that's boring. But what you're referring to is to say, okay, then what I would do, I would set up a component test or use case test, how I sometimes call them, and say, now this is my production code, the coffee shop, and now I would like to set up a code level test for some reason that tests the business logic of all of this, but also that instantiates these repositories. And if you're interested in that topic, then you can check out a little bit more of my content on testing, or maybe join us for the Quarkus workshop, because that's a longer story. But there are reasons why I advise folks to use this on a code level without any Quarkus test or any test frameworks that tries to set this up already for you. Why? Because it's going to be faster and you're going to be more flexible with your test code quality. So what I then say is I try to set up something like, let me just quickly open up another project that shows this, where I have something like use case test that actually has a coffee shop that has a few more dependencies that looks like follows. Now it's not important what it actually does, but just imagine you have a class with a few more dependencies, and in order to set all of this up, in order to, for example, verify a single use case, then you have to do a lot of work, wiring all of this up and doing the Mockito when then verify all of that logic. And it makes more sense to actually say, okay, you're going to set up some what I call test tubles, or what is called test tubles here, is to say, okay, this is gonna set this up. This has its own sort of business methods, test business methods to set this up. And then what you get in your use case, it is nicely, invocable. Now, to answer your question, when would I advise to use such an approach, or when do I use such an approach, is when you have some logic that is complex enough that it needs, or that it should be tested on a code level basis. Why should it actually be tested on a code level basis? Well, the benefit is it is faster. You can do everything on a code level, and you get a much faster feedback. You don't need to set anything up. You don't need to run your containers locally, Docker, database, whatever. You just invoke your Java code. And of course, it's very limited, so you don't test any of the integration, because in production it runs differently. But what it can do is you can test your methods and invocations and all of that already. So especially if you have something like an algorithm, something that has a high cyclomatic complexity in a small, cohesive class or method, then it makes a lot of sense to use a code level test to test that. If it also makes sense to have sort of the handling of a single use case that involves a few classes along the way, a little bit like this does, then it really makes sense to use this component tests to say, okay, I'm going to set up some reusable test components here. I'm going to wire them up like directly in the Java code without any magic and without any framework. And then I'm going to invoke my business use case methods and see if they do all of that correctly. So then I really would do that. So in a nutshell, if you have a logic that is complex enough where this makes sense, and where you get your feedback faster than only using the more integrative system test perspective. You need the latter anyway, maybe not for all of the permutations of your stuff, but at least to see, does it work and does it integrate nicely. But with this, that's really required. And yeah, I hope this answers that. Hola Peru, that's super cool. I'm really happy to hear that we have folks listening from or watching from all over the world. So that's really nice. And yeah, if the code involves integration, calling other REST services, would you do code level tests? Yeah, depends. if you can do these code level tests with mocking the other integration, like calling another REST service or actually calling a database, similar thing, then probably the easiest is to mock that. I'm doing a little bit of that here in my in this example, where I say the coffee shop here. I actually don't know what it involves. Order processor. I think this does. Yeah, this invokes another backend. Barista is another. It is actually what you're just asking. That is another thing called by REST service. And what my test tupel then does, I think it sets up the order processor test tupel, and that in case sets up everything except the barista, so it mocks this client. So to answer your question, this client would be mocked ideally, but it also really depends, because then it depends on the APIs that you set up. So if you say my class should on the one hand be mocked, but on the other hand it contains logic that I would like to test, then this is a little bit harder. So this barista class is only a REST client in my case. It doesn't contain any business logic. So there it really makes sense to just mock this for my code level test, and then for the integration system test, I need to have the full end-to-end example anyway, and I think that's a nice way to deal with this. So that's what I would say here. So yes, really nice questions. If you have some more, then please feel free to ask. So that's the testing perspective. Now, actually, that's a very nice way here to start this already. What I always show, and that's now part of my example again. This one. That's still my Quarkus dev mode, and it includes what is called continuous testing. So let's add the test output, and then I can say if I press R, then I activate or resume the testing, and then what it does, it starts. Well, first of all, it downloads, but that's only because of the first time. And now you see it runs my tests, and these tests, well, they have been run really, really fast, and this is actually really cool, because the way how Quarkus runs the tests is so fast, because it keeps the tests sort of being compiled and active. So they're already compiled. It just executes code once I press a key. And you hear this in the background. I'm just pressing a key, and it keeps saying, okay, a few milliseconds for all of my tests. So all of my tests means the coffee shop test. So per default, this continuous testing in Quarkus includes the same what Maven would include. So all of the Surefire tests here, TEST test, but not the integration test, IT. So that's a Maven convention, and also here a Quarkus testing convention. They are, let me close this again. Oops, that was the wrong one. They are excluded by default. And this is what I wanted to close. This is the reason why this one is not executed. So if I run this, then you see only the coffee shop tests are being executed here. But I can change this. I can say Quarkus test exclude pattern, I think it is. If I set this to empty, this should work. And now what it does, test output, now it runs all of these tests, and you see, okay, this is now failing again. Coffee IT. Why? Because it expects this output to be different. Okay, so that's interesting. That now has been failed, but that should fail if I change the test again to say, okay, that should be coffee dot, and now I press R to rerun. You saw how quick that was. So now it's already green after a few milliseconds. Why is this so fast? Because on the one hand, Quarkus is keeping this sort of active. It keeps my tests compiled, and it just has to start them. And then also my tests, they don't do much work. They just connect to an already running system. And this testing approach is, I think, the coolest way to just do this here. And you still see that the test is being executed. So I can prove this if I go to my coffees and say, okay, 3 lattes, and if I say 1, 2, 3, then it should now have 6 lattes here, because now they have been just created as part of this system test experience. So that is still running the same stuff. By the way, there's also, if you're interested in that, Quarkus, non-Quarkus projects. What I did running using the Quarkus dev mode for non-Quarkus project, you can check this out, is where I'm showing how to use the Quarkus dev mode for a project that is actually not a Quarkus project. This is a little bit of a hacky workaround, but it is really cool. Why? Because then you can always run your tests fast in the same way. It doesn't have to be a Quarkus application. You can, change it in a way that it doesn't try to start up Quarkus, that it only runs your tests here. So even for your regular unit tests. I think this is so cool. Why? Because even if you run this in your IDE, if I now try to press, Control Shift F10, did you hear when I press the key? The IDE says, okay, it's only 90 milliseconds, but actually once I press it, 2, 3, it takes, a few seconds to actually run it. So it says it runs really quick, but the difference is if I now press the key, then the result is already there. So that's kind of cool. And that's the reason why I just like this approach and, the continuous testing and Quarkus dev in general. Again, if you're more interested in this topic, you might want to check out the courses. I actually have a course and all of that where I show tricks like this and a fully fledged testing approach for a real world project. And the same will be covered if you want to join us for this workshop day. All right, some more questions. Thanks, I've already watched your videos about testing. Oh, cool, okay. Greetings from Georgia, nice. So it's really, really international crowd. I really like this. Aibar, hi from Kazakhstan. Hello, привет, back to Kazakhstan. And yes, so what else do we have? If you have more questions, please feel free to ask. So now what I wanted to prepare just, for these sort of updates, project, bump Java, Quarkus version, test Qt, panache. So we did test that. I included the Qt example. I just have to see if I have to update something here. Rest easy Qt, that should work. We had our, I think it was called orders controller with the template, and there was /orders, that should work. We had this here, yes, now it's latte. So this is just, a very basic example in which I'm showing some Qt features. So first of all, a for loop, and then the typical, include something, a comma, except the last one, and all of that, is solved really nicely in Qt by just saying, okay, you can have a count for all of them, you can have access the members, you can say has next or not and include this in the if and for and when, and all of these things are supported. I think that's really cool. So that works quite nicely. What I wanted to see, because I remembered when I invoked this, it didn't work. Yes, that's a 404. That's not cool. Let's say we include some more, what should that be? Let's say a root controller or something like this, or a root resource. What should we have? We could have something like a JAX-RS resource for either a redirect, what do you think, or maybe a redirect to this resource where we say, okay, if we get something here, that can be a HTTP response saying redirect. So I always have to think if it's see other or see other would work. Which one is actually the documentation for found moved permanently? I think moved permanently would be more correct semantically. This is always the the interesting thing. Or see other or found. I think found is and see others are temporary. If I'm mistaken now, I could look up the documentation, but I think we use the moved permanently. Moved permanently to, of course, the header, where we include the location header of saying location, this should be moved to the other site, orders. So let's see, that should work. And then you might say, okay, what happens if we have this? Then we get the following the redirect. And then we say, okay, now this goes to a coffee orders HTML. Nice. Okay, so that is included then it's a little bit nicer. Okay, I think that's very nice for getting started with Quarkus already. So we have, you know, a few examples that we can show with the panache. We have the Qt that we can show. The database that I wanted to show you as well, how to set this up locally with the testing environment system test. So what we do for now is the following, that we say, if I stop this again and if I start up my dev mode, because of these dev services, it starts up my database as well, which on the one hand is nice, but here you see this, it takes a while. It takes like, I don't know, 2 extra seconds, which you might complain is not that long, but actually for a different reason, I like to set up my stuff on my end with more flexibility. So when I say, okay, this should already be running, this shouldn't be provided in most of the cases by the dev services. To get started, it's really nice, but then for a real world project, you know it yourself, very quickly this goes into, okay, I need my own data, then if I provide this makes more sense. If I set up the database structure, it makes more sense, and especially once you need external systems with this. So what I would like to do, I would like to include this just by setting it up. Now I have to see where I have such an example. Was it even a Quarkus playground? I had some example where I can set this up with a database. Let's see, Quarkus. No, where was this? Something like I think it's even a coffee testing database, local run environment, something like that, where I have, a Postgres example. So this makes sense, where I say, okay, please set this up. Usually what I do, I actually say, okay, just please create a shell script, for example, run a database, because what this does is just to say, okay, Docker run for a particular Postgres version. Now I have to check this out. Actually, that's not the latest. Basically what I do, I say, I can call this coffee shop DB, yes, or Quarkus or example DB. I usually use a Docker network that I have. Why? Then I can use this hostname actually to access it, which might or might not make sense, but in a containerized environment, that's the way how I usually access it, as opposed to localhost. But for now, I can keep this. I can let this keep this out. Use a password, that should be fine, and then I can say, okay, please load something here. Postgres. Let's check this out in the Docker Hub. What's the recent version here? Postgres latest 15. Okay, 15.0. Okay, whatever. Let's take this and then start that up, and then saying, okay, that should work. Run database. No, it pulls the image and then starts up the database. And in the meantime, what I say, okay, now I have to configure it where it actually resides. So for my application properties, I say, do I have this? Yes, as a shortcut. So I can say, set this up here, Postgres, for this URL, localhost 5432, Postgres. In my case, I do want to generate the data. Then I could say, okay, I could dump the data and then include it in a script and things like that. But for now, for the example, that's sufficient. And then I can say, okay, it's already in use. Okay, interesting. Yeah. So let's stop all of that. And I think I have to clean my Docker. Okay. All of the old Docker containers that are not even running anymore. And now I can run my database, and now that should work. So now I have a database, Postgres. It was basically a Docker run, And now what it does, it should start up all of that stuff, but now it should detect that I don't want, yes. Now it started up faster and I don't want the dev services to be used, but it uses now my database. So I still have only one running, and then I can use this in the same way. I can say, okay, please execute my tests 1, 2, 3 to create some data as well. And then, connect to my database, localhost, Postgres. I always forget the syntax here. Postgres, correct. And then I have my coffee orders table, and I can say, okay, see what's in there and stuff like that. Trick question: who knows how to quit Postgres? I don't know who created that syntax, \Q to exit this Postgres service. So this is usually what I set up locally. So I basically say, okay, just run, you can use a shell script, you can use Docker Compose, you can use, your Kubernetes files, whatever you want. But basically what I do, or what I tell folks, is to say, set up your environment in just a way that is very pragmatic for you while you develop locally, and then start up everything. So now I could say, start up my stuff.sh, which runs your Quarkus dev with your Maven build up front, which runs all of these tests what you want, and runs your database, so just that everything keeps working. For this example, it's very straightforward and almost too simple, but for a real world project, then you want to add some data. Then you might want to add your own schema, and that really makes sense to just include then, where then you can say, okay, now, load something else here, wait for my database to be started with some health checks and all of these stuff, so that, you use some automation here. So yeah, hi to Turkey. Really happy. Such an international crowd. We have really a handful of countries all around the world. That's super cool. And yes, so these were some things that I wanted to show you in this live session. So if you have some more questions, please feel free to ask now. I pretty much showed what I wanted to show here. So just, update some Quarkus project here for the next upcoming conference presentations and talks. This was just, as always, a more loose session, but I like this, and I like especially when folks from all around the world are joining. This is super cool, and when you can ask questions. And yes, with this, I hope that showed a little bit. If you're interested in more of that topic, you can also check out my courses. Maybe you want to join on the workshops on my blog and YouTube channel. You find all of these videos. You can just watch them there, available there. And yes, maybe I see you in some of the conferences. Nobody said they're from Israel or Poland watching. Otherwise, we might bump into each other now in October and November. And yes, so one more question. DTOs, do we still need them? Yeah, I love this consultant answer. It depends. So it actually depends, as stupid as it sounds, if you need them in your code. And well, to be more precise, from my perspective, there needs to be a reason from your mapping, or from how the structure of your DTO looks like. So what does that mean? If you say you have a class or some structure that maps whatever you would like to have in a decent way, for example, this coffee, if it says, okay, you have the ID and your type, then go for it, right? Because why not? So in case you say, well, I would like to have my coffees here, if I type correctly, then what does this mean? Well, per default, it tries to make something clever out of the structure. So now this is being mapped via JSONB out of the box, because I include this, right? So then I could go and say, okay, the ID is certainly totally not interesting, so please JSONB ignore this by JSONB transient. And then if I do this again, now it's gone. And then I could say, okay, maybe include something else. So don't call it type, call it whatever. So for example, saying JSONB property, instead of calling the value type, call it, I don't know, drink type. And then it will do so. So you could change something here, which, is, what is the English expression? Two-ended sword, or two-sided sword, or something like that. Where it really depends if that makes sense for you. Usually I would say be pragmatic with these types. There's really nothing wrong in using your domain entities if it's one single annotation that just then makes everything, fit perfectly together, to say, okay, this is what I need. So if you add, 1, 2 annotations there, or if you add an annotation with your own JSONB serializer, deserializer, or type adapter, I think is the name, which then controls how you want to map that. That's A. That's one. Secondly, if that's not enough, if you need more structure, for example, if you say, okay, I would like to have my coffees here and I would like to have a hypermedia link. Let's quickly do this because that's fun. In case I say, let's remove this again. I don't want to have this structure, but I say my coffees in my coffees resource, yes. Actually returns this not as that list, but for some reason says, okay, I would like to have my own JSON array. Now what this is a JSON P type. Programmatic JSON access, for which I say, okay, coffee shop get coffees, and then stream this, and then map this in another way. For example, say, okay, create an object builder, and say this coffee here then should be added to, I don't know, have your own type, which then you need to create, yourself. And say have your own, I don't know, hypermedia like self link, where you say, okay, then whatever you can actually use. This was the one link that I was referring to. This one here actually that shows that how to do this in a way with HTTPS. So for example, say get a base request builder, include the path for this particular class, and so on and so forth. And then say build this, include the path for that, and then include the path for this method down there, get coffee. So coffee's resource class get coffee for this method, and then build it with this particular parameter ID. So add this, and then build the whole thing, and then map this to there's a collector. JSON collectors to a JSON array, and return that. I hope you're still with me. I know it's late for some of you. So basically, I want to create JSON objects here in this map. And one thing is I want to create a self link. You will see in a second what this does. Now I included that. So that's going to be the link, hopefully, if I did everything right, to this, yes, to my type. And that works. So in case, that was the second example, you need more flexibility, then if it's only on the edge of your application, if you say you have some business entities that then you need to, I don't know, persist or encode to JSON, that you have more flexibility there. This is already sufficient for a lot of cases, especially if you have dynamic or different sort of views or representation of your domain entities depending on the resource. So if you say /coffees gives you this, and then /coffee/something gives you that without the self link, or with the ID, or without, and all of these permutations that you might want to have. So that's one example. That's the other, right? So in two different flavors, so to say. Then JSONP is really helpful. And now the third example, or the third thing that might make sense, is then what you say with DTOs, or data transfer objects, where you actually need a specific different type that you want to include for some reason. So where you say, okay, now I would like to have my own coffee order teaser type that only includes in this, and then what you do, you create your own class. So then what is helpful if you say you create a class that basically encapsulates sort of this logic, is if you provide something like a builder method, or in your constructor the other type, that then at least you have that logic only once, how to map it, how to load all of the data in. So that's what I would do then next, but only if the other two things are not sufficient. So from my mind, I would say be pragmatic first, start with something that just works and does the job here. And you can do so. Why? Because hopefully you have proper system tests that actually verify that all of that stuff works. So if I say, and that's really important, let's quickly do this. If I say I don't call this type, but coffee type, then I expect this other test to fail. Okay, no. Because, oh yeah, that's a good one. That's another really good reason. I expect the test to fail, and here that's just a warning. Why does my test now not fail? I changed the interface from type to coffee type. Bonus question for the Tuesday evening. Why did my test not fail? And this is a really important point that I now I didn't do this on purpose, but I now just proved my own point. I say these system tests should reside in their own project. Why? Because otherwise you can go into these garbage in, garbage out situations. this uses the coffee type, and the coffee type now has some changes in persistence here, and then says, okay, how this is going to be retrieved, then just might or might not change. So, which is why I would say, okay, don't reuse components here. So this uses the other API endpoint, where, you know, if you use the teaser like /coffees, then it would fail. So really know what you're doing there, and trying to have this in separate projects and really specify which API you're accessing here. And you know, then you can test that. So for example, if I would change, I think if I would change this here, then it should fail. JSONB property, coffee type, and say, and now, yep, now it should fail. So it says, okay, that's null. Why? Because it's accessing the wrong type. And if I run this again, now it's green again. And now this other one. If I had a test now, what is missing? I didn't do fully TDD. I implemented an endpoint here without having the specification for that. And then I should have this in a separate way, and then it would, you know, it would properly fail, because I just now changed the interface of this, right? So that's another example. Do you use bean validation? Here not. I didn't include bean validation here. That would be a different example. In the course and on my workshop, I will show that as well. Here I'm not using it. So this would be the valid annotations and sort of like. Okay, cool. Do you have some other questions related to that? So DTO is also a very cool question, especially with here the different mechanisms. From experience, I think things like programmatic JSON creation is already very helpful, and I think that's also a cool, you know, thing to just keep in mind. Okay, nice. So I think we covered a lot here already. So now we also included, what do we had here, like JSON. Yeah, DTOs. We included DTOs. I had another root resource, so I can then, you know, commit that. So yes, thanks a lot for your input and your questions. If you have some more questions, now is the time. Otherwise, I would wrap it up. You know, all of these live codings I always try to make in a accessible, easy way here on an evening. So I'm really happy that you can join from, you know, all over the world here and watch the live coding. Okay, so with this, yeah, feel free to check out that material. Oh, one more question. Is DAO any relevant? DAO stands for Data Access Object, and I would say is a perfect example of this. Why? Because, well, you basically have a data access object that is in fact your repository here. And the good news is this is mostly being provided by Quarkus. So you don't have to include all of that logic yourself. You don't have to, well, this creates, you know, find by name, find whatever. So it you can have your own business logic like methods, and I advise you to do so if you need them, but actually you don't necessarily technically need them, because my repository is also empty, as you can see. And in a way, this is sort of my DAO object, right? So there's this, I don't know, this was almost decades ago, where it says, okay, this DAO pattern is sort of that or not. You could argue in different ways. I mean, you could argue this entity manager that is that still can be used is sort of implementing the DAO pattern. This is implementing it in a much nicer way. So you have all of the default methods available that are also used here. You know, find all, find by ID, list all, and so on. And that's kind of helpful. And if that is not enough, then you can define your own and say, okay, you know, what do we have? Find espresso orders. And then you say, okay, you know, list by type equals espresso, something like this, where you say, okay, where, so this internally builds up where queries. You can check out the documentation on that. And then this is a really nicer DAO that is already bound to your domain, because you define these methods if you need them. So that's kind of cool. And Yeah, that is in fact, you asked DAO or repository. That I would say that is the DAO sort of. But to answer your question, definitely repository. That's enough. You don't need another another class, and it doesn't even make sense, right? Because this other class would only inject this just to do something else. But you don't need that because you could define it right here and just use these methods and make it on a very nice abstraction level. That's why I really like this repository approach, because unlike the entity manager where you had some lower level method invocations that you then still see in your code, which is not that bad, but it's kind of ugly. Here you really can define just a single invocation that reads very nicely. You can define your own name, find exactly these orders by espresso, whatever. You can define these methods and invoke them. They're bound to your business domain. This totally makes sense. So yeah, use the repository. Thanks. Yeah, you're welcome. And thanks to you for all of the questions and for joining. I'm really happy. And yeah, I'm serious. These live streamings are always fun for me, especially when you say and show that you're connecting from all around the world. That's super cool. Different time zones. Here is now also getting dark in the evening. And yes, thanks a lot for watching me and for joining on this in this evening. And another question: is there any better Vim plugin in IntelliJ rather than IdeaVim? It's quite buggy. Yeah, to answer your question, no, there isn't. At least I haven't found one. IntelliJ IdeaVim. I cannot confirm that it's buggy. I thought it was kind of buggy. I had to write a few. What is this? No, be quiet. Don't show any. I didn't want to have that. I wanted to have this. This one was a refactoring thing that I had to keep, so then it's more deterministic when you press some actions here. And then also in this dialog there were, you can check out this this post, what I had, and that solved most of it for me. Now I cannot confirm that it is buggy. It used to be a little bit buggy, but once you get a few settings under control here that under your .idea vim rc file, it should be better, at least for me. I cannot say that it's now buggy, but to answer your question, no, I don't know of a, what is this? Oh yeah, that's that video. I don't know of any better plugin. So that's also the one I'm using, and actually I'm very happy with it. I mean, probably it's not perfect, I don't know, but for me it's much better than not using it or any other non-existing plugin. At least I haven't seen another thing. So VS Code Vim plugin is better. Yes. I'm not using VS Code, so I cannot comment on that. Oh yeah, one thing, but it's not a bug, it's more like a missing feature. In the idea Vim, you cannot use a few Vim things, like you cannot use the column norm. The recordings are a little bit slower, but usually it's good enough. So sometimes what I'm doing, if I need some more advanced Vim stuff, I quite quickly take my code and copy and paste it and just open up a Vim real quick and then edit the stuff here and copy and paste it back. So that's actually what I'm doing fairly regularly. Not even because it's buggy, but this, I think it's colon norm feature or something like that, is normal mode is missing. And sometimes if you code stuff in IntelliJ, and if you're just in the middle of editing some crazy text that you don't want some auto indentation or some auto highlighting an error, completion or something, that it makes more sense to have this in an editor that doesn't try to be smart about your code. So that's why I sometimes switch quickly into Vim. But then if you have some shortcuts for copy and pasting and switching your windows quickly, then this is quite helpful. It does not work norm. Yes, exactly. So this doesn't work here in visual mode, at least. Okay, which is the reason why I sometimes switch over to using Vim there directly. Okay, any other questions related to that? To copy paste from console, yeah, which is also what I'm doing. So if you use the console, what I can really recommend, always have a working copy and paste way available in all of your environments. So I mean, that's obvious for these sort of copy and paste. but also into and from the command line. For example, when you say you have something here, echo hello, that you say, okay, copy this with a pipe, for example, that then has this, or also copy the command with Control O, and then you can paste it here again. So just have all of these, typical scenarios available, like you say in the chat. That is really helpful to just say, okay, you're more productive there. Have you tried using Vim or NeoVim for Java programming? No, I mean, not at least in a really sensible manner. Sometimes when I'm doing workshops or showing some very basic things, like Hello World programming, or actually when I'm trying some stuff out where I say, okay, write some Hello Java class, I can sort of do this, and then say, okay, write this, and then some main method, and write that stuff myself, sort of like that. So yes, that works, but not really in a sensible manner. Because if I go and say, I would like to then have it in a more way where it would resolve my imports, where I have a plugin, then ultimately you're just recreating your IDE. And though it might be more flexible and all of that, but for me, I don't say that I'm even, close to being that good that I could recreate IntelliJ. So for me, IntelliJ is just perfect, and there is really no need to do that. And having IntelliJ with the idea Vim integration, although idea Vim is not perfect, but it's really, really good enough for me. It's just, for me, so good that I don't miss anything else. So no, I haven't. Okay, any other questions related to that? And we're already streaming for almost 1.5 hours. That's really cool. Time flies always when we do this, and yeah, I'm really happy that we can do this and that you're joining here. So yes, I want to thank you already for all of these questions and from joining for all over the world. Do you have anything else on your mind, or what's actually stuff that you're working with at the moment, in case you're not, I mean, let's say except Java and Quarkus, is there anything that you're mainly working in your main project, saying, like any frameworks that you're using, any specific area? That's also interesting. So if you have something, paste that into the chat. Are you planning to have videos on distributed system and designing? At the moment, not really, because I can give this question back. Do you see the need for some specific design? I put a little bit of that in my book, like the first Java EE related book, for just saying, okay, from a microservice-based perspective, what would be a design to, start with pragmatic HTTP connections, databases, things like that. What I have is quite old now, a video course that is available for free on YouTube for CQRS and using event-driven architectures and event sourcing. That is something, although that is certainly not what I would recommend for most projects. So that's more really like a special type of use case. Other than that, for the default projects, I would say it's really a question what would make sense to have something like a video course or videos, right? Because if you say most of it, if you've read the book Domain-Driven Design, most of it is really having a deep understanding about the domain and thinking about what makes sense, like what is a sensible slicing of your systems, of your applications, and how they can communicate, and who has the data responsibility over which type or which representation of which type. And for that, it's really more an organizational question, or technically organizational question, of how to do this for your specific domain, rather than saying, okay, you have to use this technology or have to use this in this approach. It depends on your project. And yeah, maybe some design thinking would be helpful there. But I mean, I can give this question back to you. Like, you can tell me what type of content there would be helpful, or something specific. But I'm not planning this at the moment. And we tried event sourcing and quickly rejecting it. Yes, it's always an interesting. I mean, event sourcing is also, again, like without even CQRS or event driven, already interesting. But yeah, working on an online poker game. Okay, that's definitely fun. That's interesting. I've never really created a game actually. And yeah, some other things like just let me know in the chat. That's super interesting. So, or also like the question that Shivam has, if you have some other things that you would like to see in a video, or something where you say, okay, that you're struggling with specifically, like specific questions that you have here, please feel free to request sort of videos or something that I can record, put on YouTube, and then you can watch it again or something in a quiet moment. If you have specific things that you're if you think about, just let me know, or you can ping me on Twitter, of just saying that's something I typically struggle with, or that we struggle with in my project. So really happy to help, and if that's something, then just let me know. All right. So by this, yeah, really happy that you joined me on this live session. Now we are there for 1.5 hours. I think we can call it an evening. And now also looking at the chat again. I know there's always a delay of roughly 10 seconds when I'm speaking. So for me, it's sometimes this awkward pause where I say something to ask into the chat, and then there's silence for like 10 seconds. And fan out design implementation using completable future. Okay, that's fan out design. Yeah, okay, fan out design. That's interesting. That's also a little bit more advanced to say, okay, where is your data and events going? Implementation using completable future. Okay, that's computable future and completion stage is also very interesting type. And yeah, that alone you can do a lot of cool things. I mean, just on a basic plain Java project to just parallelize things and then get the results and join them. That's kind of cool. Whoever did some JavaScript and promise stuff there, that's something. I would like to see Quarkus with AWS Lambda. Okay, interesting. Yeah, Quarkus, especially with native there, is really interesting. Okay, so that's definitely interesting. I know a lot of clients of mine are using AWS. Me personally, not that much, but it's with the Lambda, it's definitely interesting for the scale to zero approach of saying having Quarkus and then compiling it to native with GraalVM and seeing that. That's definitely fun. Yeah, I can keep that in mind to see that if that helps. That could also be cool. Okay. So with this now, I think that's a nice point to stop for the day. So again, yeah, I want to say thanks a lot for joining. I hope I actually can see you at some of the upcoming maybe conferences, or maybe then next year. So I plan to do a few in-person conferences again. I also trying to do a little bit more live coding, maybe once, or this AMA sessions, maybe once per month. I think it's fun. So yeah, feel free to join that. And if you're interested in some of the content that I'm doing, feel free to check out the courses or the workshops that I'm offering there. And with this, really thank you very much for joining from all over the world. So in that case, have a great day, have a great evening, have a good night. And yes, thanks a lot for joining and for watching, and I hope I see you soon. All right, bye-bye.